Good evening and welcome on behalf of Learnus to tonight's annual lecture. My name is Richard Newton-Chance and I'm the chair of Learnus Council. Learnus is dedicated to connecting educators and world-leading scientists who specialise in the study of the brain, the mind and behaviour in order to use the evidence and insights from high-quality research in these multidisciplinary fields to improve and enrich teaching and learning for all. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sam Wass, who will be delivering our annual lecture. He leads the Institute for the Science of Early Years, which is funded by the European Research Council, Research Councils UK and others, based at the University of East London. East London is one of the most demographically and socio-economically diverse areas of the world, and a major focus of his research is on understanding how different early life environments and different early interpersonal interaction styles influence the development of concentration and stress during infancy and early childhood. In addition, Sam is active in the public communication of science. He appears as a press spokesperson for public organisations, including the Department of Education and Public Health England, and for commercial organisations, including Lego, Disney Plus, and many others. Sam is also co-founder of Nest Kids, which runs training for practitioners working in early years. He's written a book published last year called Take Action on Distraction, the definitive guide to improving attention and focus in the early years and Key Stage 1. Tonight's lecture is entitled Brainstorms, the Neuroscience of Learning, Tantrums and the Modern World, and I love that video. Please switch microphones and cameras off during the lecture. Please post any questions you may have using a chat facility in Zoom, and we will pick them up at the end of the talk. The video of the lecture, together with any slides, will be posted on the Learnus website in the next few days. Please do subscribe to the Learnus YouTube channel, where this lecture and all our previous webinars are available. Now, I'm delighted to hand you over to Professor Wass for tonight's lecture.
Good, really, really nice to be here, and well done to many of you who I know are going that extra yard, which I find so admirable in turning up to something like this at the end of a long day. As Richard just beautifully mentioned, I'm talking to you from the Institute for the Science of Early Years and Youth, which is based out in East London, which, as Richard mentioned, is one of the most kind of interesting and varied, and in a lot of measures, it's one of the most kind of demographically and socioeconomically kind of mixed and diverse areas of the world, certainly kind of within the UK. And our real mission is to look at this idea of, how the different types of environment that different children experience during early life kind of affect development. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So we talk about diversity, between children, between those, going to school in 2006. But what I'm going to be talking about today is a slightly different perspective, which is how childhood has changed over time. So we know that we live at a time when childhood is changing kind of faster than it really has ever changed before, according to a lot of measures. So just to illustrate this, we're going to start with a little thought experiment. So this little marker on the map is where an imaginary child called Alice is very close to our campus, where our labs out in East London. And we're going to imagine this imaginary child, Alice, kind of sitting on the front step of our house as her parents are kind of hanging out the laundry. And we're going to imagine this scene 1,000 years ago to start with. So what would a little girl sitting on the front step of what would have been a wattle and daub cottage 1,000 years ago, what would she have seen? Well, she would have seen massive expanses of salt flats. She would have seen a big empty landscape. Right then, that position was right on the edge of London. And probably she would have been, in a situation where she's sitting there waiting for her kind of mother or father to hang out the laundry. And she can see for miles on end. You get these incredible big open landscapes, but really nothing within her field of view, apart from maybe a few gulls, kind of a few crabs. And, for an hour, there would be nothing that would change, nothing that would come, nothing that would go. Think forward to that same child, also called Alice, sitting in exactly the same spot, also sitting on the front step of her house, waiting for her parents to hang up the laundry 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, there'd been a massive flood of urbanization. Yeah. So, these crowds of belching chimneys and smoke and dust and activity and money. She would have been sitting watching horse-drawn carts go down, a dense bustle of kind of liveliness, of activity, things that she has to kind of jump out of the way of because, a cartwheel might come and squash her knees. Really, really big changes in, just the amount of people, the amount of activity, the amount of different objects that her brains has to track. Yeah. Think to Alice sitting there in exactly the same spot. This time she's shot upwards onto the 34th story of a block of flats that she lives on, but she's also sitting on the balcony of her flat, waiting for her mum and dad to hang out the laundry. And Alice, in addition to this rich, kind of complex scene, which has got even more complex from an urbanization point of view in the time by shooting upwards. But in addition to that, she has on her lap an iPad. Yeah, it's too much nowadays to ask children to sit and kind of wait for their parents to hang out the laundry. You get given an iPad, which has this, remember I was talking about the density and complexity that comes from urbanization, the number of different people kind of moving in your field of view, the number of different times you might have to kind of move, kind of cut a step to get out of the way of something. And this density and complexity is equally there for Alice on her balcony, but it's condensed into this small screen. So she's watching a video of Coco Melon with 10 little characters, each kind of small, kind of moving, singing, kind of dancing along. Yeah. So what we use our brains for, as children, minute by minute during our childhood has changed kind of radically. And it's changed very, very recently. Yeah. So from a DNA perspective, 1,000 years is, I can't divide, is, 200 generations. And it's a really, really kind of small amount of time from an evolutionary point of view. Yeah. So from a really important point of view, the DNA that are 1,000 years ago, Alice would have had in her kind of coding for how her genes develop is basically the same DNA that we have now. Yeah. But these changes in how we're using our brains minute by minute as children, these changes are really, really important for this really basic fact that the brain is plastic. Yeah, the brain doesn't just develop from a inbuilt genetic blueprint in our DNA like other parts of our bodies, like our hip joint do. Yeah, our hip joint just basically gets built as long as you've got enough nutrients. It gets built in exactly the same way. The brain is different. Yeah, it has this amazing ability to kind of sniff out what its environment is like and to calibrate itself accordingly. Yeah, so it learns what type of environment am I living in, and that changes kind of how it develops. And we've shown that in many, many ways. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about how childhood is changing, focusing in particular on this idea that I highlighted, these two different ways through urbanization and through screens, in which, the information that we consume, the things that we use our brains for, the environments that we process as we're growing up, are in lots and lots of different ways getting more complex and more unpredictable, more fast-paced, more densely packed with information. Yeah. So how is this affecting brain development? Because remember what I said, our brains are plastic. So these changes in childhood are materially affecting the structure as well as the function of our brains. Okay. So we're going to be talking about that today, and we're going to be talking about it in the context of something that we think a lot about. It's obviously a really, really big issue, I'm sure, for all of you, in your day-to-day jobs, which is about how children are changing. Yeah. And so we know, I'm sure you're very, very well familiar with this fact that, nowadays, in the UK, 1 to 4, 18 to 24-year-olds meets the threshold for the diagnosis of a mental health condition. The diagnoses, particularly of affective disorders, so things like anxiety and depression, are increasing fastest over time. And this is a mixture of two things. So one is that we're diagnosing this more readily. Yeah. So at a given level of severity of symptoms, it's easier to get a diagnosis nowadays. Yeah. Which is great. I think most people would say, yeah, if someone is in a situation where they can get access to support through a diagnosis, we're trying to make it easier for them to get access. Yep. But there's also another side to it, which is also equally evidence-based, which is that symptoms themselves of mental health conditions, particularly as I say, anxiety and depression, are going up over time. And we know that from studies that have, done as far as we can in kind of measurement of behavior and mental health symptoms. They've measured the same thing in exactly the same way, using exactly the same set of, really objective questionnaires over, 100 years or so. And these studies are showing that kind of symptoms of mental health problems themselves are going up over time. So it's a combination of those two things. Okay. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So how childhood is changing, how this is affecting brain development, and viewing this particularly from this point of view of kind of symptoms of mental health conditions going up over time. And what we do at the ISEY, the Institute for Early Years and Youth, is we try and capture, the child's perspective on these early life experiences. So we use a lot of kind of miniature wearable microphones and cameras and stress monitors and brain recordings to try to capture, the sights and sounds that children experience in real time, whether it's in an educational setting or a home setting, to try to understand how these changes that I'm talking about in early childhood, how they're affecting children. So we're mainly, as Richard mentioned in the introduction, so we're mainly kind of funded by taxpayer-funded research organisations like the European Union, through the European Research Council and Research Councils UK. But we also do quite a few consultancies for different kind of early years providers, people who kind of nursery chains, people who make products kind of internationally as well. And we provide policy advice for lots of different people. And again, as Richard mentioned, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is in this book on concentration. Okay, so childhood is changing. So just to get us into this idea, so one of the things that's a very vivid feature of my childhood, so we've now moved to Lewes in East Sussex, which is a very small town. But my eldest two children were born in East London, very close to the research centre that I was based. And one kind of vivid kind of memory from my own kind of experience as a parent was Freddie, my son. So he's 6 now. But when he was kind of 18 to 18 months to 2 years, he was just learning to do that, slightly tottering, slightly meandering way that kind of toddlers kind of learn to walk, and they're not quite in control of where we're going. And he was walking down a street, and he took his first meandering steps, and he started to veer right just as a lorry was thundering down the street. So that is kind of one of the things I mentioned earlier in this context of urbanisation, just the amount of different things that we have to track that are potentially, threat relevant in the context of this lorry are so different nowadays to, Alice, who, remember I was describing the 1,000-year-old Alice, the amount that different objects that she had to track, from someone sitting in exactly the same spot 1,000 years ago. So that's one way in which childhood is different that we're going to be talking about. And another way actually comes, I'll illustrate this with another story, actually from Freddie too. I think this was probably happened about a year later, which was I was in a greengrocer. So there was a greengrocer that I used to go to. And I was inside picking out some peaches. And Freddie said he wanted some oranges. And the oranges were on the rack outside. And I said, okay, fine, you go and get some oranges. So he walked, what was about 4 meters away from me, outside of the door of the shop, to these orange counters on the street. And the looks that you get from people in East London from letting a 3-year-old child go that far away. And, I knew he was sensible. I knew he wasn't about to just run and do a kind of swan dive under a car or anything like that. I knew I trusted him. But it's very much a real shock. And you very, very rarely see that. And it's because when we're living in a city like London, we're surrounded by strangers. So in Newham, where I live, where our research unit is based, 19% of the population moves in and out of the area in a given year. There are something like 300 different languages spoken, kind of massive kind of groups of different people from different parts of the world that are constantly changing. Yeah. So in a village, as a child, you regularly see the same people each day, whereas in a city where most of the children live nowadays, you're surrounded by strangers. Yeah. And this is, as I say, not just a pattern kind of common to us. 5% of the world's children were born in cities 200 years ago. By 2050, 70% of the world's children will be born in cities. So this is one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. The other thing, obviously, is screens. So again, to illustrate this, I'm just going to talk about an episode that will be familiar to almost all of you listening. When this is Rose, my daughter, who's 4 now. When Rose was 18 months old, we took her on a long haul flight to go and visit some of my wife's relatives. And as many of you would have experienced, by about 5 hours into this flight, I was feeling very much like a bent kind of rusty nail. I was sat in the middle seat of the 3 rows of seats. Rose was on one side and Freddie was on the other side. And for 4 hours, they'd been climbing over me non-stop, stopping occasionally on my shoulders to jump up and down to try to squash my spine even deeper into the seat. And I did what many parents do, which was, out of desperation, I pulled out the iPad and put on Coco Melon. Yeah. And the effect it had on Rose was really, really quite astonishing. So she went from being what we call hyperkinetic, so constantly in movement, to being completely motionless. Yeah, the movement that came up on the screen just had this amazing effect of stripping all of the movement out of her body. Yeah. And what particularly interested me was that I was, obviously interested in what she was watching and very closely tracking, what she was aware of. And I was pretty kind of confident that the content that she was viewing on the screen was stuff that she didn't understand at all. It was about a type of animal. I can't remember exactly what type of animal that I was pretty sure she hadn't seen. So she didn't really know that. And she didn't know the context and she didn't understand. So that got me interested in one of the things I'm going to be talking about today, which is what is it about screens, this movement, this complexity, this fast-paced movement, yeah, that has this astonishing effect of attaching children's attention even when they don't understand what they're watching. Yeah. So that was the first thing that I was interested in. Yeah. And the second thing was, again, I'm sure you will all have recognized this. Yeah. And the minute, I had my 20 minutes of bliss where my spine could straighten itself from being jumped on by my children. But my 20 minutes of bliss turned out long term to be an extremely bad idea. Yeah. The minute the screen came away, she was ratty as anything and remained so for the rest of the journey. Yeah. And again, I'm sure you've all experienced this at home. Okay. So those are just some stories to illustrate what I'm going to be talking about today. And this answer to all of these things, yeah, the learning, the density, the effect of the movement on her body, and the effects afterwards and putting her in a bad mood, the answer to all of these questions lies in this part of the brain, right down at the bottom of the brain, just when your spinal cord is coming into the bottom of the brain, called the brainstem. Yep. So the subtitle of this lecture, Brainstorms in the Brainstem. And to understand how this part of the brain ties together all of these different themes that I've been introducing you to, we need to kind of step back and take a couple of kind of lessons in kind of neuroscience that are kind of foundational things about how all brains work and about how young brains work differently. Okay. So the way that all learning works is that our brains are prediction machines. Yeah. So word by word, as you're listening to me talk, it's amazing to think you're not aware that your brain's doing it at all, but every single word that I say, your brain is jumping and trying to guess the next word that I'm going to say after this. So if I suddenly cabbage and put a word into a sentence that is unexpected in the context, like that word cabbage, yeah, your brain would have generated, if I was measuring your brain activity, it would have generated a little surprise signal, yeah, that wouldn't have come if I'd said, yesterday I went down to the shops and I bought some vegetables and I bought a cabbage. Yeah. So from that and lots of other studies, we know that our brains are constantly tracking, what I'm saying, tracking the context, tracking the expectations, and making these very, very fast predictions for what I'm going to see and happen next. Yeah. And so I've illustrated this in the context of speech, but all forms of learning all forms of learning work in the same way, like this boy that you can see here who's about to bite into a a carrot. And when he does that, his brain generates an expectation, a guess as to what the carrot is going to taste like, and then he gets the data back. This is what the carrot actually tasted like. Yeah. And all learning works that I use my prior knowledge to make a prediction. Yeah. And I use that prediction and based on that prediction, I gather some data. So in that case, that is what did the carrot actually taste like? And from that, I calculate the prediction error, the difference between what I was expecting it to taste like and what it actually tasted like. And I use that to update my knowledge. And then that generates prior knowledge for next time. Okay. So as I say, this applies to all forms of learning in the brain. Yeah. From learning language. As I say, you're generating predictions every word that I say for what I'm going to say next, through to learning to taste, through to learning motor skills, through to learning everything. Okay, so that's kind of brain basics number one. Okay, and the next thing that I need to tell you about is that everybody learns best in situations where you can predict what's going to happen some of the time, but not always. Yeah. So if, for example, I am stuck staring at a brick wall, yeah, and I can rapidly get to the point where my brain is going to guess what I'm going to see every time I look around the wall, yeah. And so when I'm in that situation, this process of generating a prediction, testing was my prediction correct or not, and updating the prediction error accordingly doesn't work so well simply because there isn't so much prediction error. Yeah. And so I'm not learning. So I find it aversive. Yeah. We call it getting bored. Yeah. So similarly, though, if I'm in a situation where I can't see any type of a pattern at all, yeah. So say, for example, you'd accidentally clicked on the wrong link for this talk and you'd found yourself in a lecture on particle physics delivered in Japanese. Yeah. So in a situation like that, assuming obviously that you can't speak Japanese and do fluent particle physics, you are in a situation where your brain can't ever predict what you're going to see or hear next. Yeah. You never get that prediction right. Yeah. And in those types of situations, we don't learn so well. Yeah. The prediction error needs to work sometimes, but we need to get it right sometimes in order to see a pattern there for us to learn from. Yeah. So similarly, those types of situations we also find aversive and we tend to shy away from. Yeah. We kind of seek out kind of familiarity, context where we can guess what's going to happen some of the time, but not all the time. And the technical term for this in neuroscience is the Goldilocks zone. Yeah. Are named after Goldilocks, who liked her porridge not too hot and not too cold, just as our brains do. Okay. So that's true for all brains. Yeah, this idea every brain learns best in situations where we can predict what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all the time. But for children who don't have so much prior experience, it operates very differently because a situation that is predictable to my 46-year-old experienced adult brain, yeah, is unpredictable to a child's brain. Yeah. Everybody learns best in situations where they can predict what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all of the time. But for a child who has very little prior experience, yeah, they seek out very, very repetitious things because even if it's very repetitious and very predictable, their brain is not very good at making predictions. So still for them, it's in their Goldilocks zone. Yeah. So this is why my 3-month-old daughter at the moment, what she does, her favorite thing to do, she can't move very much. Her favorite thing to do is to look from one side to the other. And then she looks back, and then she looks back all the time with an expression of calm, focused enjoyment. Yeah. And she would do that for like 10 minutes at once. Yeah. And what she's doing, she's trying to engineer something that is very easy for her brain to predict. Yeah? I've just looked over here. No, I'm going to look over here again. I'm going to guess what it looks like when I look over here. Yeah. When she's a bit older, she will start banging spoons on the table for exactly the same reason. Yeah. It's a simple, repetitious thing. I do the same movement and it helps me to pair the movement part of the brain with the auditory part of the brain that I hear the bang. Yeah. When she's 12 months, she'll start playing games, with her nursery staff. If she knocks a spoon onto the floor, they then have to pick it up and put it back. The next thing she does always will be to knock it onto the floor again. Yeah. It's the same type of thing, engineering predictability. Yeah. So this is a really, really powerful feature of lots and lots of different types of early learning. Yeah. And it's why, for example, this picture is here to remind you to tell you about Teletubbies. So I just was organizing a developmental neuroscience conference, and we got in people from different fields who knew a lot about early childhood from a not neuroscience point of view. And my choice was Anne Wood, the originator of Teletubbies, and in The Night Garden, because she just has these amazing insights into young children's brains and how they learn differently. And one of the things that she does is I think this is Tinky Winky, the purple one. Please put it in the chat if I'm wrong. But we've just been watching a video. So Tinky Winky is there with this video, and then the video comes up onto the screen, and then you watch a 2-minute video, and then it comes back to the Teletubbies, and they say again, again, yeah? And then you go into the same 2-minute video again, yeah? So this is highly aversive for most adults. Yeah, I've just watched a 2-minute video, so why would I watch it again? Yeah, and it's because our brains are very good at making predictions. Yeah, so we, based on context, based on other types of video that we've seen, based on our inbuilt knowledge of language from all the language that we've heard, my brain is very good at predicting what's going to hear next. Yeah, so the first time I watch it, I enjoy it because it's in my Goldilocks zone. I can predict what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all the time. But the second time I've watched it, my adult brain extracted all the information from it first time. So the second time it's way too predictable. Yeah. We don't like it. We don't learn from it. So we don't like it. Yeah. So we find it aversive. Yeah. But a child processes exactly the same thing very differently. Yeah. A child's brain won't have extracted all of the meaning from it the first time through because their brains lack prior knowledge. They lack prior knowledge of language, of context, expectations. So they won't have extracted all the information. So the first time through, it would have been too unpredictable, like a lecture in Japanese and in Japanese on particle physics. But the second time through, yeah, they can use their knowledge of the repetition and what they saw first time to help to make more predictions. Yeah. So the second time through, it's closer to their Goldilocks zone for them because it's more predictable. And this has been well shown in lots and lots of different studies. You can show, a child the same video 5 times in a row, and their viewing time actually goes up over time. Yeah. Whereas in adults, it shows the opposite predicting. So this is one learning principle. Everybody learns best from situations where we can predict what's going to happen next, some of the time, but not all of the time. Yeah. But young brains that lack prior knowledge need more predictable experiences, whereas adult brains seek out unpredictability. Yeah. Similarly, it's exactly the same reason why almost all children go through this phase of only wanting to eat very predictable foods. Yeah. So Rose, my daughter, who's just starting reception, is the running joke in our family that every day at supper, we ask her what she had for lunch, and she always says cheese sandwich. Yeah. And it's not just the idea of eating the same food again, but, a cheese sandwich like this, it's even the case that, that bread and that processed cheese and that slice of ham, every single time you take them out of the packet, they will always taste exactly the same. Yeah. So it's not just that she's eating one food again and again, but she's eating a type of food that is very predictable in how it tastes. Yeah. And this governs all kids' food likes. Yeah. Broccoli, there's lots of various different reasons why children don't like broccoli, but one of the key things is, broccoli, more than any other vegetable, you cook it 30 seconds longer and it completely changes the taste. The difference in broccoli between how well cooked it is massive. So for a child, that makes it very unpredictable, which is one of the reasons they don't like it. Yeah. So the reason that this is important to think about is this is a learning mechanism. Yeah. Just as there's an awful lot of, a terrifying number of websites. I was trying to get for this video a picture of a toddler banging a spoon on a table. And it's terrifying how many websites there are about how to stop toddlers banging spoons on the table. And I'm like, this is part of their learning. And similarly, an astonishing amount of effort goes into trying to encourage young children to eat more varied foods. Yeah. And again, there's a reason why they seek out predictability, and it's because it helps their learning. Yeah. Their brains aren't very good at making predictions. Yeah. So they seek out familiarity. They seek out repetitiveness. They seek out something that's easy to predict. Yeah. Because their brains don't have much experience. So they seek out the easiest food to predict what's going to taste like to maximize their learning. Yeah. As they get better at that, they will naturally move on to seek out greater unfamiliarity. Yeah. So it's not something we should be stopping children doing. It's part of their learning journey. Okay. So over time, with practice, our brains get better at making predictions. And with that, the Goldilocks zone keeps moving. Yeah. So we've got this transition from early life where we learn best from highly predictable, repetitious interactions, through to later childhood, where we learn best from more unpredictable interactions. Okay. So this is true for all children, yeah. But just quickly, I wanted to mention that it's especially true for disadvantaged learners, yeah. For exactly the reasons that ought to be obvious given what I've just saying. We're using our prior knowledge to make predictions, yeah. So if I don't have so much prior knowledge because I'm a child with English as an additional language or a child who's, struggling to kind of pick up language, yeah, I can't use my prior knowledge of language to help me, tune in to what I'm kind of expecting to hear. Yeah. So I can't generate predictions so well. So I even more so for that type of child than for a typical child. Yeah. I need these kind of slow paced, repetitious, predictable interactions to learn from. Okay. So what about the modern world? What about all the stuff about the modern world that I was talking about earlier? How is any of that relevant to this? Okay. So I've just been saying that in early life, we learn best from highly predictable interactions, yeah? And what modern child gives us, yeah, modern child gives us, as I was talking about earlier, in a lot of ways, is exactly the opposite of what we need, yeah? So I've illustrated this here with this concept of screens, yeah? So kind of children's brains are much slower than adult brains. So my adult brain can see up to 10 frames a second, yeah? An 18-month-old, the fastest that they can see is 1 frame per second. Yeah. So anything that's been and gone faster than 1 second, I used to illustrate this by holding up an apple and dropping it in front of my kids. And it's very, very clear that they can see the apple up here. They can't see it when it's moving, and then they see it when it lands on your floor and on your other hand. Yeah. So anything that's faster than a second for an 18-month-old, they can't see. It happens as a blur. Yeah. And if you think of the amount of content, how fast-paced a lot of the content that's in screens is just simply paced at a pace which is much, much too fast-paced for young brains to catch up with. There's loads more. We're doing lots of research on this at the moment, but that is the takeaway message. Yeah. So at a time when their brains need slow-paced, predictable interactions, they're getting fast-paced, kind of densely packed, very, very information rich, but extremely kind of complex information coming at us. Yeah. And this is going up over time. Again, I haven't got time to talk about, I could talk about this for hours, but, the shift to short form video content, as well as, long-term trends that have been there since we started making film and TV. TV is getting more and more fast-paced, yeah, more and more densely packed with information, yeah, which is fine for adults in lots of ways, but for young children, it's exactly the opposite of what they need, yeah. But it's not just about screens. It's also, as I was talking about at the beginning, in lots of ways, city life is more densely packed and unpredictable. Yeah. There's more objects for us to track. Yeah. Think back to that scene from a child 1,000 years ago on the Dockland. Yeah. There were kind of birds to track, sure, but massive wide expanses where there were no objects, no things that she needs to represent. Yeah. Whereas in a city, there's just so much that is there that might be relevant to what I'm doing. Yeah. So there's more for our brains to track, more for us to predict what is going to happen. But also, as I was saying, kind of people and social interactions in cities are in lots of ways more unpredictable. Yeah. A child growing up in a village will see familiar faces each day. A child growing up in Newham in East London will see thousands probably. Right. I mean, I probably think we used to see 1,000 faces walking my son from home to the nursery. It was like a 10-minute walk, but probably about 1,000 faces. And they were unpredictable because they were unfamiliar. Yeah. We spend childhood surrounded by strangers. Okay. So this is in a lot of ways, the modern world, modern childhood is changing to become more fast-paced and unpredictable. Yeah. And this is affecting young children in particular, because during early development, we need slow-paced, predictable interactions. Okay. So that's a little bit about that. But what about this thing I mentioned when I was talking about Rose, my daughter? We put her on screens, 20 minutes of bliss, but why did it make her ratty afterwards? Okay. So the answer to this also lies in the brainstem, this part of the brain that, actually, I may have forgotten to say this, but this process of calculating a prediction and updating the prediction all is governed in the brainstem through a neurotransmitter dopamine. Yeah. So the brainstem also does another really, really important thing. So it's monitoring these errors, it's monitoring this predictability, it's generating dopamine when we find something that we can learn from. Yeah. But also, it also does something really, really important, which is when I'm in a situation where stuff is coming at me too fast, yeah, where I can't predict what's going to happen next, yeah, it sends off signals to our brain and our body, yeah. To our brain, it sends off lots and lots of signals that basically maximize the brain's ability to cope in an unexpected and potentially threatening situation, yeah. So it maximizes, I think. I'm going to say more about that in a second, yeah. But it also sends a signal to our body. Yeah. And again, from an evolutionary point of view, this is very, very sensible what it's doing, which is recognizing that we're in an unpredictable situation. Yeah. And it's sending signal to our body saying, okay, I can't predict what's going to happen next. We better be prepared to run at a moment's notice. Yeah. And it sends a signal down to our body to put us in what we call the sympathetic nervous system activity. Yeah. Fight or flight mode, colloquially. Yeah. And that involves kind of our heart starts to beat faster in preparation for getting more oxygen to the muscles. We get a big release of energy to the muscles. We start to sweat in anticipation that we're going to have to cool ourselves down because we're expected to do lots of exercise. Our mouths dry up because we haven't got fluid to spare because we're expecting to do a lot of running. And it's all about maximizing our body's response to a situation where we might actually have to fight or run for our lives. Yeah. So this is why children are ratty when they come off screens, yeah, as every parent will have noticed, yeah. And it's because when they've been on screens, yeah, information has been coming at them too fast for their brains to process, yeah. They're struggling to keep up. Their brainstem recognizes they can't keep up. So it sends a signal to the body to say, okay, you better go into fight or flight mode. We don't know what's going to happen next, yeah. The parents notice this when the child comes off the screen, yeah. They notice that they're very energetic. They're very combative. They have a lot of kind of fight or flight in them, literally. Yeah. But what they don't notice so much is that at the time that the child has been sat there, motionless on the sofa, yeah, no movement at all in their body, but their bodies are in this hyperactivated sympathetic nervous system fight or flight mode. So their hearts are going faster. You might notice, I've noticed it with my kids, that they're sweating even though it's not hot in the room. Yeah. And it's all this fight or flight mode. Okay. So nowadays, obviously, this isn't useful. Yeah. This used to be an adaptive thing. Yeah. But nowadays, it's not useful. It's triggered by the modern world being fast-paced and unpredictable. Okay. So we're now just in the last 7 minutes or so of the talk. We're going to start talking about how this is relevant for practice. And I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail. I'm just going to flag up a few things. Okay. So one of the things that's relevant is, remember that I was saying that when our brainstem registers that we're in high alert mode, yeah, it sends various different signals to our brains, yeah, to help us to respond to this situation that we recognize as unpredictable, yeah. So one of the things that it does is it makes us more kind of sensitive to when there is movement or sound anywhere in our visual field. Yeah. And again, we've developed like this because it used to be useful. Yeah. I'm in an unpredictable situation. Yeah. 10,000 years ago, when we lived in environments where there were a lot of predators out there wanting to eat us. Yeah. If I'm in an unpredictable situation, it makes sense that if there's any movement that happens anywhere in my visual field or any small little sounds that are happening anywhere, yeah, I immediately start to pay attention to them. Yeah, is an adaptation that used to be useful when we were living 10,000 years ago. Yeah, nowadays there aren't any predators in our environment that want to eat us, in the UK at least. And what used to be useful has now become a real pain because it means that when we're highly stressed, yeah, we find it hard to concentrate, particularly when we're in a setting like any kind of classroom where there is always movement and always sound happening. Yeah. And there's lots and lots of evidence for these papers that I'm not going to be talking about in a lot of detail about how exactly it shifts our brain patterns. But the short answer is when I'm highly stressed, I find it harder to focus on something that I'm doing, and I'm more responsive to movement or sound anywhere in my visual field. Okay. So that's one way in which you may have noticed that modern childhood, the children coming through your doors are different nowadays. And this is why. Yeah. But there's another thing which I think is really important, that there's also something that we're doing a lot of research in, which is when I'm in this high stress state, yeah, I'm also more unstable. Yeah. I'm more likely to collapse into something like a tantrum. Yeah. And what happens in a tantrum? So we do lots and lots of research into this. What happens in a tantrum is your brain, which is in this high activity state, goes into what we call a chain reaction. Yeah. And this is a chain reaction that's kind of mutually amplified between you and the outside world. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a picture from a child throwing a tantrum in a school, but I'll illustrate this from an episode from my own family life. So, as a very bad habit I've inherited from my parents, whenever I'm going away on holiday, I have to pull an all-nighter the night before, catching up with all the work that I'm going to miss during my holiday, so that I feel I've earned my holiday. So reliably, every single time we're in the car, packed up, going on holiday, I'm in an absolutely filthy mood. Yeah. And my children pick this up. They pick up that I'm in a filthy mood. Rather than, Freddie saying to Rose, well, that's a nice toy. Can I have a go when you're finished? He'll reach over and try and yank it off her. Yeah. Which means that because I'm stressed, react very differently to that as I normally would. Rather than saying, are there any other ways you could get that toy off your sister? I will turn over and say, can you shut up, please? I'm trying to drive, or something like that, which they then in turn affect their own levels of stress. Being shouted at by daddy makes them even more stressed, which makes them even more oppositional, which makes them even more likely to get shouted at. And we have these kind of vicious circles where basically everybody is winding each other up. Yeah. Obviously, in schools, these happen slightly differently. As practitioners, we fight very hard not to kind of let a child's mood affect us. But there are some things, if you've got a child who's causing physical harm, you have to restrain them. There are lots and lots of different things where you have to be more direct. You have to tell them off in front of other children, which is increasing your stress, where you get these same types of chain reaction cascades. So this is one thing that happens to us more when we're in a high stress. We're more vulnerable to collapsing into these chain reaction cascades. Yeah. You also get the same thing, what we call an internalizing cascade. Yeah. So this is an externalizing cascade. So my stress is reinforcing itself through interactions with the world around me. Yeah. But you also get these internalizing cascades where my stress is reinforcing itself within me. Yeah. So this is, perhaps easiest to understand in the context of adults having panic attacks. Yeah, very, very common. And what happens in a panic attack is, something will increase your stress. With a friend of mine who I was with when I had a panic attack, he was chewing nicotine gum to give up smoking, which increased his heart rate, but he didn't realize that, he'd forgotten about that at the time. But he suddenly noticed that his heart was beating faster, which made his mind worried he was going to have a heart attack, yeah, which meant that his heart beat even faster, yeah. And you get this same chain reaction cascade, but we call it internalizing between my body and my mind, yeah. This is an externalizing between me and the outside world. It's the same thing, but this is the same thing, but within me. Yeah. And obviously, this children kind of having internalizing meltdowns is a very, very common feature of childhood. Okay. So I'm going to have to go fast through the last section. But the last thing I wanted to highlight, and I'll just spend a minute on this because it is important. Yeah. Is the other area that we're trying to do research on. It's really, really hard to do research on is I've been talking about, the short-term effects of being in this unpredictable situation, watching a screen or on a city street, yeah, and how that short term increases my general levels of arousal, yeah. But what we also think is happening, it's very hard to be sure from human research, but there's some good quality animal research on this, is that this also has long-term effects too, yeah. If I'm used to being for hours on end in this high stress state when I'm watching a screen or I'm going around a busy city street, yeah, then that has long-term effects, yeah. And the other thing that we think is true, which is really, really interesting, is that once we get used to being in a state, we try and engineer our environments to get back into this state. Yeah. So a child who's used to watching a lot of screens is used to being in this high stress state, and he will try and engineer situations that are high stress. Yeah. Whereas another child who doesn't have so much screens, they won't. They'll be happy in that state. Yeah. So you talk to people who work with children and they see this happening a lot. Yeah. A child, it can be quite quiet, quite calm. And one child in particular who you get a feeling, has a very unpredictable, high stress home environment. And for this child, they can't quite cope with everybody being calm and focused, yeah? And they will do something quite deliberate, yeah? They'll either, do something that they know they've been told not to do, like climb on top of a pile of blocks and then, look at the practitioners and say, okay, what are you going to do about it, yeah? Or they'll go up to another child and snatch a toy off them, to engineer this, yeah? And this is that child calibrating their own environment to get to the level that they're used to. Yeah. They're used to being in this high stress, high activity state. Yeah. They're calm and that feels uncomfortable to them. So they try to engineer a situation which is, more high stress because it's what they're used to. Yeah. Which is a very hard problem for you to know what to deal with as practitioners. I'm not going to talk about that today. If anyone's interested, ask me in the questions. I do have some ideas, but I haven't got time to talk about them today. Okay. But just, back to the idea of, attention and learning that we've been talking about. Yeah. So what can we do to help? So I'm just going to whiz through this. I'm actually 1 minute over time already. I'm just going to whiz through this just to say most of these ideas are in this book, if you want. Okay. So it's all about increasing predictability. Yeah. So one of the ways that we can increase predictability, give young children what they need, yeah, is we can be clear. Yeah. We can exaggerate our mouth movements. We can think about how to design physical environments, bearing in mind that high stress children are more distractible. Yeah. And we can think about our emotional communication. How can we increase the clarity of our emotional communication? Another way in which we can be more predictable is by being very rhythmic. Yeah, either with our fine-grained speech rhythms, back through the mud, squelch, squirt, squelch, squirt, back through the river, splash, splash, very predictable rhythms in language. That makes it more predictable. Young brains like that. That's why they love a bear hunt. And we can think about predictable daily routines, doing the same thing at the same time each day. Yeah. Again, young bodies like that. It makes the day more predictable. It's all about increasing predictability. And then another way that we can increase predictability is be thinking about being child-led. Yeah. So these are some pictures of children with autism who find other people very unpredictable. And something that they're doing, they've built these little robots that just exactly copy what the child with autism is doing. Yeah. And they love that because, their Goldilocks zone for a child with profound autism, their Goldilocks zone is they need really simple, really repetitious interactions. And for those, that's right. Even then, they get it right some of the time, but not all of the time. And just doing the same simple, repetitious thing over and over again is a really, really useful thing for a child with autism who finds, adult-led, peer-led interactions too complex. Okay, that's all. I'm slightly over. Apologies. Just to say what I've said, and then we'll do questions. So we've been talking about how all learning works through this process of generating and testing predictions. We've been talking about how all brains learn best in a situation where they can predict what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all the time. Yep. We've been talking about young brains who aren't so good at making predictions. They tend to seek out highly predictable, repetitious things, which maximizes early learning. Yeah. Especially disadvantaged learners. Yeah. And then we've been talking about how the modern world, in a lot of ways, gives us exactly the opposite of what young brains need. Yeah. We need slow-paced, predictable interactions. The modern world is giving us fast-paced, unpredictable interactions. Yeah. And we've been talking about how this has an immediate effect on children, putting us into this high alert, high stress mode. And then I've been talking a little bit about where I think there's a good case to be made about that this is also having long-term effects. Our overall levels of kind of brainstem arousal, alertness are going up over time as a function of the changing environments that we live. Yeah. And then we've talked about how this affects children. It makes them more distractible. Yeah. It makes them more likely to go into these chain reaction cascades, either an externalizing cascade or an internalizing cascade. And then very quickly at the end, we talked about some ideas for what we can do to help. We can increase predictability by being clear, by being rhythmic, and by being child-led. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for listening.
Sam, thanks so much for that. That was a real tour de force. You mentioned the brainstem. Did you mean the cerebellum?
Um, no, the cerebellum's a little bit behind. So the kind of key area that I didn't want to talk about too much, but is the kind of locus ceruleus, so a part of the brain that does a lot of it's very involved in this kind of error monitoring, but it also has these kind of connections up and down to the rest of the brain.
Right.
Cerebellum's kind of more, that's not so
Yeah.
much my area, but that's more kind of motor learning and that type of stuff. But yeah, very specifically, the locus ceruleus, which is this tiny little area. It's about 15 millimeters right in the bottom of the brain, but really, really crucial to understanding
Okay.
children.
We've got a great one here. What is the main thing that you've learned from your children that has challenged your research knowledge?
I mean, I mean, I feel really guilty about I think of it more the other way around, actually. I think of it more that I do come across an idea in my research or do a finding, and it makes me realize that what I've been doing with my children is, completely wrong. And it's all based on this idea that you assume that your child learns best in the way that your adult brain learns. Yeah. You don't understand these differences between, how a 4-year-old's brain learns and how my 46-year-old brain learns. Yeah. So, for example, when Freddie, my son, who's 6 now, was 4, we decided he was allowed to watch Netflix. And I started by me choosing what he'd watch. So I'd pick out a program, give it to him, and he'd watch it. Yeah. And then after about 6 months, we decided that he was allowed to choose for himself what he watched. And if you look back at the viewing history, yeah, when I was choosing what he'd watch, I just automatically chose a different episode each time. Yeah. A different show a lot of the times. Yeah. The minute he was allowed to choose what he watched, he'd always watch the same show every single time. And often he'd watch that same episode again and again and again. And I felt really bad because he'd missed out on a lot of learning. I've been giving him some really suboptimal learning, yeah, just because I assume that the way that my brain learns best is the
Yeah,
same way that his brain learns best, and it's very, very different.
yeah, yeah. It is fascinating, isn't it?
Mm.
Somebody says this sounds like you're recommending the Montessori approach.
Yeah, so Montessori, in a lot of ways, you read Maria Montessori and you really do think in a lot of ways, oh my goodness me, she anticipated this. Yeah. Um, One of the emphasis on kind of child-led learning and the focus and lots of different ways. She had amazing, foresight into stuff that neuroscience has found out similarly. One area that's quite interesting that there isn't very much of, I've had a good look through, is this idea of kind of, particularly this idea of slow pace. Yeah.
Mm,
So, she's very into, child-led learning, but just this idea of kind of how long you have to wait. I talk about this a lot when I'm doing kind of
yeah,
training for kind of early years and practitioners. There's this idea that you just have to wait so much longer. I mentioned, an 18-month-old's brain is 10 times as slow. Anything that's been and gone in less than a second, they just can't see. Yeah. Um, and Maria Montessori doesn't talk about that very much in her thing. This pressure of how much you've got to slow down, and I think it's because nowadays my 46-year-old brain has had 46 years of getting faster and faster as a result of all having to process all of this fast-paced content and information that comes at me. Yeah. So when I'm sitting in the evenings, as I do, staring at my 3-month-old daughter on my lap, yeah, and she will stare at my face, but only if I've kept my face completely immobile for a minute or two. Well, when she was about a month, she would do that. Now she can cope with some movement, but when she was about a month old, I had to keep my face completely motionless for her to look. Yeah. But the amount of effort it requires nowadays to do that, to slow yourself down to the pace of a young child, is so much more nowadays, yeah, than it was 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, the pace that an adult would live at would be quite similar to the pace of a child because we haven't been
yeah,
sped up by
yeah,
fast-paced, complex information coming at us, whereas we have now. So nowadays, it's so much more effort to slow ourselves down. So that's one, point that for my money, if she were writing now, she would talk about much more. Oh, that's interesting. Louise, can I put my email in the chat? If you wouldn't mind email pointing me to the bit, then I'd be really grateful.
show things for breakdown.
I'm just putting my email into the chat, Louise. If you don't mind emailing me, I'd be really grateful for that. Really interested to hear.
Yeah, somebody has made the point about making me think about interactive whiteboards on all the day in classrooms. I don't know
Yeah.
if yeah, I don't know if that. I was in a secondary school myself, so I don't know whether early years setting
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so there's lots to say about this, Richard. That and also, quite a few of my friends who are teachers send me, videos of kind of little kind of YouTube clips or something that, they've seen being used in classrooms, which are, exactly the extreme end of what I would be saying, exactly young brains don't need. Yeah. But it is a challenge for the simple reason that when what I was talking about this highly stressed children, Find it easier to pay attention to movement. Yeah, that we have these kind of warning mechanisms going off in our head that automatically alert us to movement. Yeah. So if I'm teaching and I'm teaching with a lot of movement, yeah, then it's easier for a child to focus. Yeah. Similarly, with an interactive whiteboard, if there's a lot of stuff happening on an interactive whiteboard, yeah, it's easier for the child to focus. Yeah. But so it's a
Right.
really tricky question. Do you just go for, what is easy, what is going to help the children to focus? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or do you go for the, short-term pain for long-term gain, which is,
Right.
I'm going to try and strip that away and I'm going to try to help them to learn to pay attention to me through comprehension-driven attention, which targets very, very different brain networks.
Yeah.
This, pay attention to movement that's happening and is very much brain stemmy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas this, there's no movement happening. No, like when we're reading, yeah, how we pay attention when we're reading. There's nothing that moves to try and attract our attention when we're reading. Yeah. We're in control of every eye movement. Yeah. And in terms
Yeah.
of brain mechanisms, that's very different type of paying attention. So do you do that? So do you take the easy route of cramming a lot of movement and exciting flashing in so that the children find it easier to look at you? Yeah. Or do you say, I'm going to take that out and I'm going to try to build up comprehension-driven attention, which is, much more of a slow burner. And it's a really, really hard call to make as a teacher. I'm,
Yeah.
I'm really glad I don't have to because it's really tricky.
Um, uh, Debbie says, could you talk a bit more about how the need for predictability applies in neurodiverse groups, such as autistic children? Are you aware
Yeah,
of
so
any connections with the fight or flight response and the sensory sensitivity that some
yeah,
autistic people experience?
Yeah, so there's tons to say about that. So one of the things that I think is really really important is this mechanism that I was talking about, that everybody likes things that they can that everybody likes things where they can predict what's going to happen some of the time but not all the time. But for young children they need to seek out predictability. Yeah. And then naturally, as our brains get better at making predictions, yeah, we naturally start to seek out more unpredictable things just to stay in the Goldilocks zone. The Goldilocks zone keeps moving. Yeah. And one of the things that you can really see as an early marker of children who might be on neurodivergent trajectories is just simply how long they keep on doing the repetitious thing versus moving on. Yeah. And that is a marker basically of how this process of calculating the prediction error, learning and updating it, how fast that works in their brain. Yeah. So, that is why, for example, so there's a lot of really nice papers that I can send you if you want, Debbie, looking at things like why children with autism tend to do a lot of running a train up and down in a track. Yeah. And it's simply because that is one of the most predictable forms of movement. Yeah. So, in a lot of ways, processing sights and sounds, their brains they find it harder to process these, to predict what's going to happen next. So, they seek out something that's very predictable. Yeah. And as I was mentioning, the one of the things that stays unpredictable for us the longest is kind of adult interactions. Yeah. But for a child with autism, they're especially unpredictable. Yeah. So for them, they're really far right to the particle physics lectures in Japanese. Yeah. So that's why a lot of the successful interventions like kind of ABA and a lot of the other kind of autism interventions are all about really really going for super kind of predictable interpersonal interactions, doing exactly the same thing at the same time, using exactly the same words in exactly the same sequence. Yeah. It's also why a lot of people with autism, adults with autism, they like screen-based interactions just because they're more predictable. Yeah. So by the time I'm an adult, I still find humans much too unpredictable. They're still way out of my Goldilocks zone. Yeah. But something where it's a closed system working according to a set period of rules. Yeah. People with autism are often very good at working out those, set period of rules. And that's why they often prefer, screen-based interactions. But, there's tons more to say about that. It's a really, really complex and interesting topic.
Right. Right. Can you talk a little more about developmental changes, about the shift from predictability to unpredictability for optimal learning? I spoke, yeah, and somebody else says, are there any critical ages for the movement of preference for predictable versus unpredictable?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's very much dependent on the type of learning that you're at, yeah, and the stage of learning that you're at. As a general rule, yeah, and then we talk about a lot in this a lot in the take action on distraction, but basically, if your children are struggling to pay attention, part of it, a lot of it is to do with the environment, yeah, but it's also probably to do with the content, and it might be because it's too easy, and it might be because it's too hard, yeah. And we move between different things at different times, yeah, and you can tell where a child is from whether they're seeking out the predictability or not, yeah. But then often it will be, a very different trajectories, yeah. So, my daughter Rose has stayed with predictable food for much, much longer than my son did, yeah, which must be that her olfactory kind of sensations are just not as sensitive, or she finds it harder to learn kind of
Right.
from that olfactory thing compared to someone else, yeah. Whereas Freddie, my son, is very fast at learning to taste, but something that he finds challenging, the predictability comes in. So there are lots and lots of different, there isn't a simple answer basically from when we move from something that's predictable to something that's not. Yeah. It's very much a question of how much do we know about kind of in that specific area of knowledge. Yeah. If I'm in an area where I don't know so much, I need predictability. If I'm in an area where I know more, I will seek out unpredictability. So, there isn't an easy answer to this. I think the most useful practical thing for people is almost the other way around. Rather than thinking, how do I make myself more predictable? You can say, how do I learn about my children that I'm teaching by watching and observing their own preferences? Yeah. So it's kind of the way of flipping the way of thinking about
Mm.
it.
That's such a heavy anthropological angle to it. Are there actually gender differences?
Good question. I'm going to dodge that one because I know absolutely nothing about it. And I haven't actually thought about it very much, Richard. It's a good question. I'll make a note to think about gender difference.
Um, I've got one here. In view of the molecular, synaptic, axonal, genetic, and brain structural differences in autism, how impactful can interventions be, such as TMS, verbal and nonverbal communication interventions, in improving verbal and nonverbal emotion communications in autistic children?
That question, Richard, feels way above my pay grade, unfortunately. I don't, I mean, I did
Last
do a bit
year,
of stuff on autism, kind of early development, but the autism intervention literature, a friend of mine who I was having a drink with last night would be one of the best qualified people in the world to answer that question. I'm
okay,
unfortunately am not. Um,
okay, no,
I
no,
know, yeah, I really don't want to say something I don't know about. Sorry, I'd
no, no,
stick to
no.
what I know.
I guess there are specific interests coming in here that,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and what you're
Apologies.
talking
I
about.
mean, can I just say if that person wants to email me, I can put them on to, a good
Yeah,
friend of mine who
yeah,
is
yeah,
extremely knowledgeable on
yeah.
that.
Great. What impact does this have on the neurodevelopmental or of inhibition processes?
Phew, that's a hard question. Um,
Inhibition
so
processes.
yeah, so so I've done a lot of work on inhibition, and I was just examining a Viva on inhibition at UCL a couple of weeks ago, and inhibition is very, very complex. What I don't know, my so a lot of the ways that the problem with inhibition is it's very, very hard for us to study. Yeah. So the way that we study inhibition is we do things like a stop signal task. Yeah. So you get people to press a button every time they see a green triangle come up and then not press the button every time they see a red square come up. Yeah. And you measure how many times, you get in the habit, 80% of the time you get a green triangle and then 20% you get a red square. So you have to stop yourself doing it. Yeah. Um, and that's easy to measure, and that's a good task in brain terms because it's very kind of repetitious, yeah. And you have to get a lot of samples of how the brain responds to the red thing. So you can put, 60 different red squares in and average the brain response across those 60 instances, and then look at, that. But the problem with it is it's completely different to how inhibition actually works in the real world, yeah. The point about inhibition is it's never repetitious, yeah. These tasks are very structured to be repetitious because that's what we need to measure the brain activity.
Right.
Whereas inhibition is all about the unpredictable. Yeah. So what I think, so I won't answer based on that literature, just because honestly, I think, there's a lot of limitation. I mean, I've done work on that, but I think there's a lot of structural limitations to that literature. What I would say is that I would notice is that you get kind of this general level of what I've been talking about, this kind of brainstem arousal. So we do a lot of work kind of tracking how that kind of fluctuates during the course of the day. Yeah. And if I'm in a situation where stuff is happening that is unpredictable. Yeah. As I've been saying, our brainstem arousal starts to go up. Yeah. And it's during those situations, yeah, where inhibition tends to go down for lots and lots of different reasons. Yeah.
Okay.
Firstly, these
Yeah.
kind of chain reaction cascades that I was talking about, these
Yeah.
internalizing and externalizing. Yeah. But another way that, secondly, concentration goes, yeah, again, for reasons I was mentioning, yeah, for an evolutionary perspective, when I'm in a high stress state, it's useful to pay attention. Yeah. So,
Mm.
that's another way of thinking about inhibition. Yeah. I can't focus on a task. Yeah. Because whenever there's movement there, I can't resist the urge to look at, which is again, useful. But there's another way that I didn't mention that our brains kind of change when we're in a high stress state, which is we and again, we understand. I won't explain the brain mechanisms. I don't why for this in a lot of detail, but we get stuck in our own perspective. Yeah, so we find it harder to see things from someone else's point of view. Yeah, this kind of controlled. I'm going to imagine what this situation feels like from your point of view. We just find it harder to do when we're in a high stress state. A friend of mine's done a lot of research on this. Um, so that is another contributor to, aspects of, behavioral disinhibition, like tantruming, that type of stuff. Yeah.
Mm.
So those are all reasons why, our environments, yeah, unpredictability can increase our long-term levels of kind of brainstem arousal. Yeah. And then there are lots and lots of reasons why when we're in a high stress state. Yeah. There are lots of more reasons why our inhibition goes. Yeah. And that's in thinking about inhibition in lots of different ways. Yeah. How likely I am to have an argument, how likely I am to have a meltdown, and how well I can, concentrate on reading a book. Yeah. So all of those things are harder when we're in a high stress state for reasons that, I explained.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Finally, the curriculum is clearly too busy and fast-paced. How do we use research to influence policymakers?
I mean, I'm, pretty much exactly the talk I just did. I was doing at the Department of Education Early Years
Ah,
division just before Christmas, and I've been sending them a lot of stuff because they are very interested in this because
yeah.
there's a forthcoming white paper which is going to be bringing a lot of kind of send children into mainstream schools. So this idea of kind of inclusive early years kind of practice and inclusive kind of learning practices are something that they're very kind of tuned into. Um, so I don't know, and it works in lots of different ways. I've been saying to them that the easy wins are, thinking about bringing more predictability into, your teaching routines. Yeah. So how do I introduce new content? Yeah. So when I'm, introducing phonics, do I always say, we're going to look at the sound. What does it look like? What does it sound like? Here's an example in a word. Here we have a go at writing, and you always teach the same each sound in exactly the same sequence. Yeah. I've got a project at the moment doing maths. And can you do that same type of predictability in maths? So I do, we do, you do. Actually, with Anna,
Yeah.
whose name I saw on the thing, and we're doing a project together looking at this kind of predictability in maths.
Oh, yeah.
So that's kind of practitioner practice. But the bit that's much harder to fix is the environment. Yeah. So schools are the most, as you'll all know, the most dense, complex, rich sensory environments. Yeah. And that's exactly the opposite of what children need. Young children need pared down, simple, no distractions, one voice talking against silence, one thing to look at against a completely white background. Yeah. And that's not easy to fix because there's a reason why schools are so complex and it's very hard to fix. But the neuroscience is absolutely clear. Yeah, young children need simplicity. They don't need these massive, busy, complex environments.
That has been absolutely fascinating, Sam. Thank you so much for your for doing this tonight, and thank you for your answers to those very searching questions. I think it's fair to say.
Good. Thanks. And just to say, I put my email in the chat if anyone's interested, particularly
Yep.
Louise with the Montessori, that's still up in my chat. But if anyone else has got any questions that they didn't get answered or anything, just send me an email. I'm really happy to pick up.
Yeah, that is an excellent offer. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening, and I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Thank you
Great.
so
And thank
much.
Yeah, and thank you
Okay.
so much, guys, for organizing. It's really impressive.